They say that in the world of technology and change, there are three kinds of people: those who let it happen, those who make it happen, and those who wonder what happened. Dr. Sirkka Jarvenpaa, who is on the faculty of the Department of Information Risk and Operations Management in the B School at the University of Texas at Austin, is a fourth type. She makes it happen, but she also understands why it happens. The study of technologically mediated conflicts is now a basic area of investigation, and as a leader of research in this area, Dr. Jarvenpaa has more than a few papers with the phrase virtual team in it. But she has a paper with that phrase in it in 1995. Do you remember how much you were thinking about virtual teams? 1995. Do you remember what machine you were using in 1995? Conflict no longer takes place between people in face-to-face settings, as we just heard. And in fact, perhaps conflict has a very different trajectory when it occurs online rather than offline. But yes, conflicts can now unfold in groups, organizations, and even nations when individuals use technology to build turbulence and dissent rather than coordination and contentment. Today, Dr. Jarvenpaa will be discussing leadership in global services teams, strong subgroups without active faultlines. Thank you for joining us.
All right, thank you so much. Hard to follow a presentation that hits so fundamentally to the core of what all of us are doing. Just a little history in terms of how I got into virtual teams. So my background is international business and information technology. And around 1990, I was asked to offer a course on international business and information technology. Well, at that time, Austin was a very small town. Dell was not a global company. There were really no global companies around in Austin. And so how do you create a global experience for your students? And so the virtual teams became a solution. I got the students working with all the other students around the world. So this started as a part of a course and educational experience. And only later, I decided to start writing. And again, I always tell my students is that I never read an academic paper unless I really have to, okay? Because I have to produce a paper myself or to do a review on it. So an advocate reader of everything else, including practitioner literature. So Handy had written this very provoking article in Harvard Business Review, but it was also in many other magazines, Time Magazine and so forth, that you cannot build trust virtually. And so that was very motivating for me and very much drove this paper. That's probably my most cited global virtual team paper, collaborating with Dorothy, who is one of our students. Again, this paper talks about trust, but it's not an interpersonal trust that, for example, really prevails in your relationship with Sarah. It builds on notion of a swift trust. So trust very much built around the task and the smooth process flow. So clearly, like the credibility issues would be very critical. So a swift trust. Also, again, it was a quasi-experimental study. The teams were working almost a semester, and the task required lots of interdependency. But clearly a very different context from what I've been working more recently, which has taken me into civil engineering, very large civil engineering teams, where again we don't have some of the benefits that, for example, we find in software teams, where again modularization, reuse, standards in technology are quite common. So in civil engineering, when we think about structural engineering, for example, even the kind of country practices or the engineering programs are quite different around the world. But engineering companies, again, to lower cost and really kind of tap the talent that is more and more available and ample in Asia, are exploiting intensively these global teams. Also another thing, it's oftentimes a misconception that engineers, again, civil engineers, are really about, the work is codified and everything is around the documents, the drawings. No, I would say that the documents and drawings are basically the shared space, but the conversation is very much orally based. And again, what's very, very important are these interpersonal relationships. You can senior engineer feel like they are mentoring a junior engineer. So interpersonal relationships are very, very fundamental in this business. Also because of, again, like a professional engineering license. So that's, again, an identity issue. So again, if an engineer makes an error, okay, the bridge will fall, okay, people die in many, many, many cases. And so there's a lot of personal identity tied into the engineer's work, just like we academics feel. So again, this is part of a 4-year study, and we were working with engineering firms that are servicing, I would say, the largest energy companies around the world: Shell, British Petroleum, Exxon Mobil. And as you can imagine, these teams had all the technology that they possibly would want to have available. Again, very fancy team rooms, video conferencing, and so forth. But most of the time, they opted for the lowest technology that got them connected. So lots of very traditional email, occasional instant messaging. Again, they used web conferences much more than the video features. Video, seeing how people are coming and going in the meetings was distracting to them. Okay, so important to remember. And again, remember, but this is kind of an oral culture. It's kind of continuous of providing feedback on people's work. Any design decision has lots of different options. There isn't like even a stress. We might think about that it's math. Well, actually, it's not. Okay. About even a simple question, they can spend hours debating. So one issue that again, is really, is how to provide feedback so that it is not, perceived as undermining, the identity of the initial creator of the work. So here, for example, I'm curious. Okay, a U.S. engineer conveying to an Indian engineer. Clearly, okay, they are questioning the person's capabilities. Looking at, for example, trust repair. This is a very interesting issue that have been looking at with this data set. And so, for example, what we found was that there's this continuous reversal in terms of character and role-based inferences. So often what really undermined the trust was, for example, something going wrong with the process. But then it's being addressed in terms of the person's character or their competency, or I guess I didn't have this other slide, which basically is somebody's caught basically lying in the document. They clearly didn't check, even though they put it in the document that they had overlooked it. And then the repair is basically a process. but clearly it's really about the person's integrity. So a total kind of mismatch about character and the role, and that's one of the things that I want to kind of think more in terms of to what extent trust repair, for example, really has to match the underlying attribution that undermine the trust in the first place. But clearly, what brings to underlying is this conflict, and so what we heard about is that in sometimes geography can give some room to get your feelings tempered. In these teams that we looked at, it was a constant lightning storm. So a lot of emotions expressed in these meetings and very little resolution most of the time. And again, outsourcing and offshoring. So in our study, we had a number of companies that had captive centers overseas, or they used external companies. But clearly, what is very much of a practice is to create what I call these two subgroup setups, kind of onshore members and then offshore members. And clearly there is very fundamental incentive conflict. So here in your case, there was this potential of success, and you both equally getting credit. In this context, the offshore people are always kind of short-handed. The credit, the profit, the work is really competently done, goes mostly to the onshore members. But at the same time, okay, the more the offshore members become competent, more efficient, the more fear the onshore members have that more work gets transmitted overseas. And so there is this underlying fear that you can just breathe in the air, even among the most accomplished engineers. How I got into the conflict fault line literature, working with a few other colleagues. So in an experimental context, we actually kind of looked at how the different team configurations make a difference. So for example, in my courses, when I use virtual teams, I always put the students, in a team, making sure that we maximize the different nationalities. So basically, every member was from a different country, and so horrendous time zone problems, okay, and also technology problems in early years. But then in this experiment, we kind of created this hybrid. So, two people in the same location, so kind of like a dyadic, and then we had 3 people, so almost like you have a group within the group. And again, we were able to find quite nice differences, and very much of kind of supporting the fault line theory empirically, that the teams that were totally dispersed, okay, had the highest level of trust and least conflict. Okay, probably because also it was really hard to have a conflict. Okay, so if it's clear that the project is going to fail, if you really kind of create a storm, that probably tampers the willingness to even bring up lightning storms. And then these 2 subgroup setup had the least trust and most conflict. And this is of course the setup that we continuously find companies using. Again, in some of our projects, there were few other people in other locations, but it was just temporarily bringing expertise. Okay, so this onshore and offshore setup is very profound in software engineering as well as civil engineering. And so kind of going back to the Ferguson that we heard yesterday. So it wasn't about the race, but it's a race and it's the income and it's this very discriminatory policy that all kind of come together that's going to really create the fault line. So again, what really activates these fault lines, again, the external event, like the shooting, but much of it is again activities happening in the meetings. And so again, I take a look at a lot of things in my research from a communication perspective. So again, how does the dialogue, what's being said, how it actually influences the team processes. Again, greetings and so forth. Again, we talked about that. The trust is very much different around the world. Indians are much more tuned to, again, kind of this benevolence. Okay, do I get a sense that you really care about me? Whereas the US engineers perhaps are much more on, again, looking at the credibility and the competency. So fundamental differences also, what triggers injustice. Again, for the sense of this forum, I try to look at the research in terms of what can we learn from the leadership. There's actually surprisingly little that I could find in terms of leadership, even leadership broadly speaking, and the fault line literature. And maybe it's just that I didn't try hard enough. But a lot of it is about stay away from trying to build relationships, because the more you socialize, okay, the more people actually find out about the differences. So it actually creates more stereotyping in some sense. And then if you do a lot of kind of off-site activities, beer drinking and so forth, then you get this hyper-personalization, that we really think that we are alike. We are the best buddies, and that's going to overcome any obstacle. And so people again become unprepared to deal with the conflicts. Keep it very, very task-based. And then another recommendation is if there is a conflict, then just get the leaders together, kind of interpersonal conflict resolution. And I would say that's the fundamental way that the conflicts are being resolved. And so basically the team managers just kind of get together from the different sides. And the rest of the team, most of the time, don't even know what happened. And so they are kind of in the dark. And clearly, this is good for the company, kind of overall identity, shared knowns, again, cross-cutting rewards, which again is not very useful advice for offshoring, just because there is this incentive conflict, fundamentally autonomy and formalization. So creating more a structure is another way. A very interesting paper that Carton and Cummings had, and this is actually the Journal of Applied Psychology paper, but there's also an AMR paper that actually kind of talks about why subgroups are good for, because again they are kind of really good for things that we heard yesterday, perspective taking, really bringing alternative views into the problem. So particularly knowledge-based subgroups can be very, very valuable, whereas again this identity-based, we are US, you are Indian, are the ones that tends to create coordination problems. But it's a nice paper that kind of really looks at the type of subgroups and how they have differing impacts. And so, besides the traditional theories, the subgroup literature then kind of brings these other things. For example, the inclusion theory that kind of really emphasizes of the value of strengthening the subgroups, and of course that the source paper very much builds on the optimal distinctiveness, so Brewer's theory. But again, the leadership implications so far have been quite limited that I could find. So going back to our, to this particular research. So I'm looking at one particular team, and the reason why I picked is that it was really considered very much of a successful team. Okay, it had again huge potential fault lines. So we are talking about a U.S. team actually stationed in Houston, and then an Indian team in Kolkata. And Kolkata is kind of considered very, very kind of traditional Indian setting, not in South India, where most of the high-tech companies are situated. Also, Bengali has a very much of really strong kind of cultural identity. They really value the Bengali language. So even, for example, a lot of the engineers were sending their kids to the Bengali schools because they felt like, there was too much English starting to be in the Indian society. So again, kind of these nationalistic values are very, very important in the Bengali region. It's a very leftist part of India. But clearly, again, the decision rights in Houston. Importantly, there was also an age difference. Indians were much younger, okay? They were better educated, they had master's degrees, whereas that was unusual on the US side, and the Indians had MBAs from the US. Okay, so and that probably also had something to do why it was a successful team. But so what was very interesting, and maybe this is what the paper ought to be really is about. There's a stark contrast between the interviews that were conducted with these engineers, both on the on-site and off-site. So this was an ethnographic research where we had students living at the site months at a time, and I was working with anthropologists, and so again we spent weeks multiple times in the US and offshore site. So in interviews both in the US and Indian side, it was nothing but identity fault lines. I mean, Indians felt, we are servants, the US people just go on a vacation and they just offload all this work on us. Not at all, concern about the implications on our lives. Yes?
Just a question of clarification. How big is the team? How many people altogether?
Yeah, so the overall team has 40 people. Okay, the core team is 15. Okay, so about 7 and 8 on each side. So it's a pretty even size. And again, the subgroup theory would say that the identity conflicts are going to be again massive because you basically have equal number of core members. But again, having this balance is good for the knowledge-based subgroups. Okay. Also, the global manager of the team had worked much longer and had much stronger relationship with the Indian developers. Although he was an American, actually. Long time working in Houston, but he was located in Houston. But the Indian site actually had an office, okay, for him, and so no one used the office except when he came, and there was a direct phone line to him. So he was a global manager that people felt that he was present in both places. Okay. But still, very few good words in terms of what we found in the interviews. But the meetings were incredibly smooth compared to the other teams that we had studied as part of this project. So seemingly very collaborative. So again, what really trying to analyze what this global manager did in the team to help these identity fault lines not kind of penetrating into the conversation and derailing. So again, clearly there were lots of kind of rules, and again, a lot of the rules were around the technology. So this was a team where all the documents were expected to be in a shared repository, and so there weren't multiple versions of any documents being circulated. Also, again, in these complex projects, you also had to, deal with vendors. And this particular manager did really good job in terms of insulating the team from a lot of faults, failures, delays of the third parties. So he was also good in terms of just managing the team versus the external world. Besides kind of, again, being this clearly a meta member that had a kind of a respect of the both sides, he really, much more than any of the other kind of the team leaders that we witnessed, kept coaching the subgroups to really have a common voice. Because again, what became kind of really apparent is that because again, in these structures, there is the offshore and onshore, but then there are the counterparts. So there is the structural lead in offshore, there's a structural lead in onshore. And they really are communicating, day to day. So there is a lateral communication, and so oftentimes the offshore don't really know what the other offshore members have been thinking until they come to the meeting. And so what was again striking in these meetings is that they were continuously like stop and go. Okay, so whereas typically these meetings they start at 10 o'clock and then they are supposed to end at 10. Okay, in these other companies, that's what they did. They started on time and they stopped when it was time to move on. This manager, there was a needs list, there was an agenda for the meeting, okay? The meeting ended when all the items were discussed, okay? Sometimes it meant 5-hour meetings, okay? And again, this, I would say still the burden was on the offshore in terms of inconvenience, but sometimes the Houston people had to come to the office at 4 o'clock, okay? So I think again, what kept the meeting shorter was that they knew that if they didn't resolve them expediently, they would be there perhaps even 8 hours. Okay, so again, very different characteristic what we witnessed at the other sites. Okay, and then this stop and go, meaning is that there was an issue, and particularly when a complex question get raised, rather than kind of get different views from the different viewpoints, he basically said, go offline, okay? Within your subgroup, figure out what your response is, okay? And then, when there was some clarity within the subgroup, then the meeting continued. Again, I hadn't witnessed that before. And this was, very much of the daily routine in these meetings. And so one of the things that I've tried to do is to understand kind of what happened in the meeting, what happened in this offline. And one of the things is that they still, for example, kept the video link or the audio link they lowered the volume, but you could still kind of eavesdrop, like are they still talking and so forth, okay? So it was like the other team then became a background, and for a while you were kind of focusing on your subgroup, okay? And so it seemed, very much of the sense breaking happened in the subgroups. It's too conflicting, it's too complex for people to do kind of this challenging, bring alternative viewpoints. In these global teams, they can do sense giving and sense demanding, But this sense breaking happened much more again within people who understood, where the others came from, what were the kind of the daily challenges that they were dealing with. And so just kind of quickly here, so here's the Indian subgroup, basically, complaining that the U.S. is really violating the golden rule of the team. Not updating the document and sharing them in the document. Okay. It looks like nobody's just looking at those. Okay. And so again, pretty divisive, comment. And so again, this was an instance of the Houston subgroup, discussing again at this instance the offshore, kind of starting to talk about the next item in the agenda among themselves. Okay, and so again, the resolution really was happening in the subgroup level and then kind of communicating to the overall team. Here, there's an issue in terms of again, some of the actual fabrication was happening in Philippines. So the question was, what were going to be part of the same kind of a module that would be shipped, at the same time. So it's kind of stick-built notion, Bobby's saying for stick-built, this is the U.S. That is what I'm inferring. Okay, so the India is questioning, so what's really the rationale for stick-built? I'm struggling. Again, very, forward, like, let's stop struggling, okay. So again, in other instances, this probably would have led into another lightning storm. But again, in this case, actually, both sides were going back and thinking about, again, what should be the rule. So the India as well engaging in a subgroup discussion. Okay, and then design criteria conflict. And so this is about kind of the design of the wall next to these huge pipes. And in this case, actually, they tried to resolve it. And only thing they kind of managed to do, when the conversation was kept at the team level, was basically to document that. But again, just too many different viewpoints were brought up to be able to, come up with an answer that everyone felt confident. Because again, all these third-party implications also for, how would this wall actually be constructed. So certainly what helped in this case was the hierarchy. And actually there was a really tension between this global manager and his boss. So his boss was saying, okay, we can really increase the speed of the project if we allow much more of lateral communication across all the team members. And this global manager says, no, we can't do that. We are just going to be creating more and more of coordination problems because someone, at the middle levels of the electrical team makes a decision and it really impacts structural. And the structural lead is totally, in the blind and it's too late once it actually surfaces. So he was really pretty, maintaining the hierarchical form of leadership, communication. And so then again, this coach that he wasn't, another important thing was he never conveyed the solution from one side to another. So a lot of times boundary banners are kind of conceived like translators, who basically voice the solution and with their power kind of make it acceptable to the other subgroup. So this person was not a translator. This manager always wanted to make sure that the Indians were the ones who were actually voicing the solution, or they were the ones voicing the problem. So again, in other teams, it was oftentimes the US, the global manager that kind of voiced the offshore site's concerns. So again, it was someone else, kind of speaking on the behalf of the offshore team. And that was not the case in this particular team. So again, this kind of comes back to the issue of, a lot of the literature is about, again, how we can kind of bridge, create more, diverse teams. But in a sense, we're kind of always looking at, like, how can we create shared understanding? Most of the literature on conflict and virtual teams is all about creating shared understanding. I would say, again, like in this context, you don't have time to develop that shared understanding of the problems. The problems are too complex. In many cases, you can't really understand. You don't have the particular specialized knowledge to really create that shared understanding. So particularly, I think that then this uniqueness of the subgroup has to be really celebrated. So kind of like inclusion through strong subgroups, I would say, is the message that I'm trying to convey. Okay, thank you.